Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Terry O'Sullivan, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this webinar hosted by the Social and Responsible Marketing Cluster at the Open University Business School. We're a group of academics engaged in researching how marketing can be used to create positive societal effects, not just profit, important as profit is. You can find out more by Googling social and responsible marketing, and you'll find us somewhere near the top of the first page of results. Today, we are delighted to be joined by our distinguished guest, Dr. Noel Dennis, Associate Dean for Marketing and Student Recruitment at Teesside University Business School. He is also a highly regarded jazz trumpeter, flugelhorn player, and composer. Over the years, he's also found time to publish an original and important body of research articles, drawing on his unique combination of musical and marketing expertise. His talk today will focus on how jazz insights can help us manage and market through the current crisis. Noel will talk for 40 minutes or so, and then we hope to have time for questions. Please use the text box to the right of your screen to enter your question at any time during the event. My colleague, Dr. Shah Zhu, will be acting as moderator. I will put as many questions as we have time for to Noel at the end of his talk. Any we can't get through will include with Noel's written responses in the follow-up email for this event, where you'll also be able to access a link to the recording. So without further ado, please let us welcome Dr. Noel Dennis to reveal how jazz broke down the silos, tales from a jazz musician and management educator.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Terry. It's an absolute delight to be here today. Thanks very much for the invitation. And of course, your big build up there, which was very much appreciated. So yes, this afternoon, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my work in the management education space, my work as a jazz musician, and also to sort of give you some key sort of insights to how I've used jazz to look at various aspects of marketing management discourse and other aspects of my practice. So if we could move to the first slide, please, Louise, that would be, oh, that's it, that's brilliant. Yeah, so I titled this slide, Professional Complexity, Challenges and Opportunities. And this is actually, if I may, this actually came from a presentation that I did for my professional doctorate a couple of years ago, when I was trying to make sense of all of the different areas of work that I'm involved in and how they all sort of come together to inform a really sort of coherent narrative. So first and foremost, you can see there in that shot, there is a flugelhorn and some music. So Noel, as I say here, as a jazz musician, I practice as a jazz musician. Terry alluded to the fact that I compose as well, and I do, but I compose in a very unconventional way, in that I actually use my improvisations to develop melodies for library music sort of tracks that are then used for TV purposes and adverts. Obviously, my background as an academic is in marketing. I've sort of over the years of sort of moving through the ranks in business schools from lecturer through to principal lecturer through to associate dean, have sort of widened my practice, if you like. And I like to think of myself as a management educator with marketing still at the heart. But one of the reasons for the title of this piece about breaking down silos, I think it's really important that management education is seen more holistically and broadly, a bit more of an interdisciplinary and even a transdisciplinary approach to management education, I feel is really important. And that's something that in my professional work as an associate dean, I'm working with colleagues in my institution to really sort of break down the silos of the disciplines and different aspects of discourse of management education, so that our students from whatever level they are, from level 4 up to doctoral students, can see business in a more holistic way. I think it's really important, and particularly, if I may, Terry, just picking on, you know, the sort of vision of your group there. I'm very much in that space as well. That you know, responsible management education is incredibly important, and we've got to educate leaders of tomorrow to look at the contribution that they're not just making to their own organisations, but also the contribution they're taking and playing in wider society, aligning that with the principles for responsible management education, aligning that with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So a little bit of a complex background there, and some, you know, people often ask me, how do you manage to fuse jazz and marketing together? Well, I'll tell that story here today, but all I will say at this point is that if it wasn't for my practice as a musician, I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing as a management educator. Indeed, I have used jazz as an alternative lens to make sense of my work as a management educator. If I could have the next slide, please. And this is a quote that I think is really important. So on this slide here, you see me. Sorry, I'm not into just showing pictures of myself. These are just here to illustrate a point. But you see me at the top there in full flow in a lecture theatre, and in the bottom there, I'm actually working with my jazz group. And one of the quotes that I actually put in my professional doctorate was about stepping out of the discourse to understand the discourse. And that's essentially what I've done with my work, using jazz as a metaphor to understand the key elements of strategic marketing management, and more broadly leadership and entrepreneurship even. And I think an alternative lens is really important. And for me, and this is a personal thing, I studied undergraduate management, I studied postgraduate management, and I always felt at the time that the theory and the ideas and the way it's kind of positioned was always a little bit one-dimensional. And I felt that it often lacked, and probably to a certain extent still does now, some criticality and depth. And therefore, I decided that how can I fuse, you know, my passion for jazz and what I do on the bandstand, and how can I sort of weave that to better understand some of the common sense and, you know, so, you know, no new real ideas, but some of the key ideas in relation to marketing strategy and strategic planning, for example. How can I shine an alternative lens to perhaps get people to look at those issues from a different angle and understand them a bit more better? And so that's essentially what I did. I started to look at my practice as a jazz musician and started to look at the theory in the very early days around strategic marketing planning, and started to think about, well, actually, what we're saying that it's really important to develop a strategic marketing plan, which, yes, it is, and I'm an advocate that all organizations should plan. But how can we stick rigidly to a plan, particularly given the turbulent times that we experience all the time? But this year it's been magnified, obviously, by the pandemic. So I started to look at lessons from jazz, and that's what I want to talk about today, is the key lessons and what we do as jazz musicians and how they could be translated into management education. If I may have the next slide, please, Louise. So I guess for me, I started to be active in music from the age of 8. So some of these pictures that you see here are quite important in the journey to becoming an improviser, and obviously becoming an improviser informing strategic marketing management discourse. So 1987, I got my first cornet. It's my first trumpet book, lovely Christmas present. And I started playing. My dad was a wonderful jazz musician and a wonderful educator, and he taught me the trumpet initially. And the picture there on the right-hand side of the screen is me in my father's youth band, where I learnt, if you like, I learnt to play, and I learnt how to work in a team, and I learnt how to take leadership responsibility, becoming section lead of the trumpets, and I learnt how to communicate as well, and musically, and of course developing my interpersonal skills. So that band, that picture is a really, really important lesson for me and for others. And when I'm teaching my MBAs, I always put that picture up, because, you know, I learnt the intricate workings of an organisation and the key skills that I think are really vital for leadership, for working collaboratively within organisations. They were developed through music in that band from a very early age. Now, my dad used to say to people, because it's a very successful band, he used to say, not everybody's going to leave this band and become a world-class musician. But what they'll have done, they'll have enriched their lives and developed key skills that can be transferable in other aspects of your life. And boy, was he right in that sense. So, you know, that's an important message. Number one for me really is, you know, learning to work with others within an organization is really important in a business context, but it's really, really important in a musical context as well. There is no competition in a group of any shape, size. It's all about collaboration, which is central to a successful music performance. I really got turned on to jazz though when I was about 12, and the image in the middle there is an album that my dad played for me, and Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers was one of his favourite groups, Art Blakey being a wonderful jazz musician there. And I heard a particular track called Skylark and a trumpet solo by Freddie Hubbard, and it was the most amazing thing I'd ever heard. And from that moment on, I became really interested in jazz. And as I progressed, I started listening more. I got into someone we're going to talk about in a minute, Miles Davis. I started trying to emulate the sound of these musicians. And then eventually, when I was 18, I hooked up with a really, really amazing international trumpet player, Gerard Presenza, who became my teacher. And he still teaches me now and is a very good friend. So that's my route into jazz. I think it's an important message, because if I hadn't come into jazz, obviously, I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing now and talking to you today about this. So if I could have the next slide, please. So Miles Davis here is a very, very big influence on all aspects of my work, not just musically. Miles was a formidable force in jazz. He was a wonderful trumpet player, and he was incredible at, you know, seeking opportunities and moving jazz to new levels, whilst also having quite a controversial life story. But a lot of my papers that I've published actually draw inspiration from some of the titles of Miles's iconic works. And it's important to say here that his autobiography is a wonderful read, and there are lots of leadership and management and marketing lessons in this book. And for that reason, my MBA students, it's on the recommended reading list. Really, really important. Again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is it's important to look at business and management issues from alternative lenses, because that can often bring what can sometimes be quite banosic and mundane discourse to life, and really, really get that message across and ultimately alter our practice. So Miles Davis is a big influence on my work. Obviously, I love his trumpet playing and everything, but he is, in my mind, if I get the next slide, I'll explain why I think he's central to management education. So strategic lessons from Miles Davis. These are just some of the things I want to say about Miles. First and foremost, he was an artist. He was an amazing musician, a unique sound, a unique approach to playing, and, you know, unlike anything we'd really heard before. But he actually turned the art versus commerce debate on its head, because a lot of people, and there's a lot of writing about the art versus commerce debate, and I don't want to get into it in this session, but a lot of scholars believe that art and commerce cannot coexist. Miles blew that argument out of the water. He created wonderful masterpieces, but he had a great eye for opportunities in the market. Miles, in his heyday, would be walking around in Gucci things, driving a Lamborghini, but his music was first and foremost. He just happened to know how to make money from a very, very quite niche art form, is jazz. So I title him a creative entrepreneur, and some of the things that link to that, and me calling him that, is he was central at creating certainly two new periods in jazz music. So in the 1940s, we had what we call bebop music, which was incredibly fast and melodies and lots of chord changes. And Miles was part of that movement, let me add. But towards the end of the 40s, Miles, and I guess into the 50s, Miles was getting a little bit disgruntled with this. And he was experimenting with a different approach to the music. So moving us away from fast melodies, lots of chords, and taking us to minimalism. And in 1959, he launched an iconic record called Kind of Blue. And that put an end to bebop. And why did it do that? Because what it did is it took some of these amazing bebop players, he took them into the studio, he selected an amazing band to do it, and he had some minimal sort of melodies written down, sketched out. He moved from lots of chords to what we call modes, so scales, so maybe from 32 chords to 3 chords in one piece. And he created this wonderful masterpiece called Kind of Blue. And he selected the team, as I said, and he sort of empowered them to bring his vision to life in the studio. And they went in, and I think they recorded it in one sort of evening. And the musicians he selected, he trusted them to create this masterpiece. But he was really, really clever, because he selected a brilliant pianist called Bill Evans, who controversially at the time was the only white musician in Miles's band. And he did get some because he could hear echoes of classical music in Bill's playing. And he thought that that would be an ideal way of expanding the market of jazz and his album. And he was right. And that album is still today regarded as the #1 selling album of all jazz album of all time. So that, again, it sort of, he was an innovator in that sort of sense. And he did something similar 10 or 12 years later, where he actually brought what we call jazz rock to the fore. And again, different sounds, a totally different genre of music that he pioneered. There's also great HR lessons in this autobiography. Miles was a wonderful nurturer of talent. So some of the great musicians that we still hear today, the likes of Herbie Hancock, they all served their apprenticeship with Miles. And he really sort of, worked with them and developed them, and, in a way that they were then, able to become jazz icons in their own right. I think it's fair to say that Miles is visionary, always looking for new opportunities, new ways of doing things. Later in his career, obviously, he was sort of hooking up with pop stars of the day like Prince, Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper, and he was an implementer. So he made things happen, a risk taker as well, and all of this was a collaborative process with Miles. So I hope you can see there, that's all I've done is really given a bit of a leadership, a strategy sort of lesson there, but using an iconic jazz musician to sort of underpin that. So well worth a read, folks, well worth a read. So if I may move us to the next slide, please, Louise, that would be brilliant. So what I want to talk about, what's central to the work that I've published and I continue to work on is improvisation. So as a jazz musician, I can read music, obviously, but one of the key things that jazz musicians do is they improvise. And that's one of the things that I argue in a lot of my publications. Organizations and individuals within them should have the ability to improvise, whilst not abandoning a strategy altogether. But I want to sort of talk a little bit about improvisation. Basically, it's performing and composing contemporaneously. So when I improvise over a piece of music, I'm actually composing a new melody on it based on the information that is contained within the music. So you can see on the screen there's an example of some music, some chords, and you would improvise around the chord structures and try to stay within them so it sounds nice, although you can stray outside of them and create an effective dissonance as you do it. But one of the things that people often think about improvisation in jazz is that it's all made up. Well, to a certain extent, that's true, but it's actually not. You have to invest a great deal of time to learn the language of jazz. So it is effectively like learning a new language. And so you first start to sort of listen and absorb what you hear, but then you sort of start develop and learn patterns and phrases and licks. So that picture with the music again there is one of the first lessons I ever had with my trumpet teacher, Gerard Presenter, when I was 18, because that's when I formally started to unpack what I was doing, what I was effectively making up, and actually learning what it was. And there are what we call bebop licks. So you develop these, you work on these, and you absorb them so that they become spontaneous, and you come up with your own variations on it. So myth number one, jazz is not all made up. There's a great deal of investment goes into learning the language, into learning the harmony, the theory behind it. But when you are on the stage and you are improvising, it is you go into a subconscious state, and working with the team around you, you then sort of you compose this new piece, you find something new in a tune, for example, that's maybe been written over 100 years ago. So it's a continuous process of learning to improvise. You never stop. One of my teachers said, the day you stop, you give up. And so we learn things new every day in improvisation. And again, another lesson I used in this context, shouldn't everything that we do be a continuous journey, lifelong learning? If we're working in organizations, leading, and if we're, our developing our 5-year strategy, shouldn't that be a continuous journey and continuous amendment and evolvement for opportunities to respond to threats, etc.? So that's a key message for me. If I could have the next slide, please, that'd be wonderful. And I love these 3 words because, again, these have a place in any aspect of discourse. But the late, great Clark Terry, trumpet player there, this is his formula to learn to improvise. And it's 3 words: imitate, assimilate, innovate. And any musician starts off by copying what's gone before. So in my case, it was that very first CARAVAN album, listening to Freddie Hubbard, and then it progressively I got into Miles, and you just try and emulate their sound, their phrasing, the choice of notes, and that's how you start. And then as you get a little bit more confident, you then start and assimilate that in your own approach. So someone might still be able to hear echoes in Miles, but you then become echoes of Noel or echoes of Gerard. And then eventually you are developing your own language there, whilst not abandoning what's gone before, but you develop your own unique approach. So people can then say, yeah, that is definitely Miles, or in my case, that's definitely Gerard Presenter, my trumpet, because it's got a unique sound that's absorbed all of that language into their own sort of subconscious and practice. But imitate, assimilate, innovate is the formula for learning to improvise. Now, my critique of that is that it's too linear the way it is there. I think that it's got to be a cycle, because I now start and imitate newer players that are here and assimilate it and then innovate. So I think you're constantly imitating, and because you're continuously developing, so you've got to imitate. And there are a lot of new players that come out with new wonderful ideas that you want to sort of take a bit of those and absorb it into your own practice. If I may have the next slide, please, Louise. Thank you. So that brings me then, with the context of jazz, this brings me into when jazz met marketing. And this was back in 2003. And this photograph here is with my dear colleague and great friend, Michael Macaulay. And we, in 2003, we unpicked my thinking about, strategic marketing planning and how can organizations plan and not build any flexibility into them. And we decided that we'd write a paper on it. We looked at the strategic marketing management literature at the time, and the jazz metaphor was very limited at that time. It had been used a lot in organizational studies, And it also been used quite a bit in new product development, Luhrmann and Minor, etc. Kamosh and Kuna in organisational studies, Carl Weick et al., Barrett. But there was nothing specific for strategic marketing planning. So we wrote this paper and we submitted it to the Academy of Marketing conference. And I remember Michael saying this is going to get laughed out of the conference because essentially, Noel, all we're doing is making it up based on your expertise as a jazz musician. It got accepted, and it also, thankfully, and to our very surprise, won Best Paper in Track and got published. And I guess the rest of it sort of is historical now. But since that initial paper, we've worked together and developed a number of publications on the jazz metaphor theme, and also we run quite a lot of workshops with organisations, working with wonderful jazz educator and musician Pete Churchill, the Royal Academy of Music, because this comes to life when we actually talk about it and demonstrate it with the jazz group there as well. It really sort of gets people active in the process. But as part of that first publication, we developed the Jazzer reader model, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute in a bit more depth. But I want now to move on to, why is jazz a great metaphor for business? And if we just go to the next slide, please, Louise, and we look at the jazz group here. So if we break down the jazz group and how it works. So one of the main things here, and if you have just point one, please, just click it again, please, Louise, that'd be great. Thanks. So in a jazz group, everybody has a role. Just like everybody has a role in an organisation. Now, that could be an individual role, it could be a departmental role. But everyone has a clear role in a jazz group. And each of the musicians know each other's role and they know the boundaries. So if we look at the rhythm section, which is made up mainly of piano, bass, drums, a guitar sometimes. The rhythm section are, I think, and we do in our workshops, they're like a competent senior executive team in the fact that they play a very supportive role. So if we think of the drummer sets the time, the groove, he's like essentially the engine room, keeping it all ticking along. The bass player again sets that groove, that time, pace, and the guitar or the piano, they have they set sort of like the harmonic foundations, if you like, so provide us with the chords. And then you've got the frontline musician, and here we've got a saxophone player, me as a trumpet player, who are there to play the melody and to improvise. And one point I will make here is that the rhythm sections are improvisers as well. They can be solo instruments in their own right, but they largely provide this foundation for the frontline musicians to craft their improvised solos on. Now, one of the things that's really important to sort of stress here, the drummer is a good drummer, as my dad used to say, and I think he's right, should be seen and not always heard all of the time. So great jazz drummers are the ones that are there in the background, motoring you along, and will give you the odd kick when you need it, but they're not all over the place. And we do see examples of jazz drummers that are what we call really busy, and listening to them is like watching and hearing a shed getting built. That's when the process falls down. And if you think of a drummer as a chief exec of an organization, a competent chief exec who is there to support, to encourage, to nurture, but is not getting in the way of day-to-day business and activity. They're not micromanaging, because they're empowering you as a frontline player and the rest of the rhythm section to be able to do their jobs effectively, to be able to sort of craft this wonderful piece of music, or to deliver on the strategic plan 2025. So role definition is crucial. Jazz musicians have great knowledge of the music, they have great knowledge of their instruments, they have great knowledge of the harmony, etc. So, you don't go on the stage to improvise without having that, or do it well without having that grounded knowledge that is constantly developing. If I could have the next point, please, in it, Louise. Jazz musicians, by their very nature, are innovative. If you're creating something in real time, composing and performing contemporaneously, you are then having to innovate. You're having to innovate often on a tune that is very old. So, I play a lot of jazz standards that were written in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And every time I play them, I will play them differently because I will find something new. But I'm relying on being innovative in my approach, and having that innovation attitude, if you like, is crucial. But again, it's not in isolation. The rest of the band are also in an innovation mindset as well, and they're looking for new things. So the drummer might find a new pattern that then the bass player copies. The piano player might play something, and I think, well, that's really innovative. I'm going to copy that, and that's going to span off my idea, a new idea that then goes around the group. Next point, please. Quasi-autonomous leadership. So in a jazz group, it's almost really a leaderless organization in many respects. And I'm talking, if I just put a caveat here, I'm talking about a smaller jazz combo here. I'll explain about bigger groups later. But it's largely a leaderless organization in the fact that everybody assumes leadership responsibility at different times. So, if the frontline player is soloing, the saxophone player, when they're soloing, they're in command. And the rhythm section is supporting. When they decide to stop and someone else solos, they take over the leadership in that moment in time. But they all end and come back collectively together. So it's very much there's leadership responsibility at different times. If I could have the next point, please. Kind of alluded to this around innovation, but a successful jazz group, it's essentially a musical dialogue between like-minded people. So there's constant dialogue between the musicians musically, and there's also lots of non-verbal communication as well in the jazz group. So, there's eye movements and facial expressions, again, which influence the mood and the tone of the music and where things are going. Really, really important. And isn't it really important in organizations that there's a healthy dialogue between the individuals within them and the departments within them too? If I could have the next point, please. And I kind of think that builds on the point above, really, but central to a successful jazz performance is communication. And that's, again, the jazz musicians listening to each other. It's really important, looking at each other, reading the situation, and, creatively expressing themselves and sharing these ideas amongst the musicians. Can I have the next point, please? A successful jazz group takes a very democratic approach to everything it does, from pre-gig selection of the materials, even down to organising the gig, who's going to get there. There's that collective decision making. But when we're on stage as well, there's nobody who's going to say you can only do 2 choruses tonight, or I'm going to stop you at this point. If it is the case that it's only going to be 2 choruses, for example, that would have been discussed before the performance, and it would be probably in the context of, we're doing this for a radio show, so we need to keep it short because we've only got 3 minutes. But you go to a jazz club in New York or London, you're watching an authentic jazz performance, it's up to how the musicians feel as to how long they play or solo for and where the music goes. But that is, again, in real time, when the music's happening, it's very much a democratic process going on there to sort of, take the music in the direction it needs to be. And can I have the last 2 points, please? Thank you. And, ultimately, jazz musicians, they collaborate. Okay, so there's no competition between them within the group. It is very much about collaboration. And that's what makes it a really, really magical thing. When I'm on the stage and I'm working with some amazing musicians and I'm just listening, which is the last point, listening to what they're doing and thinking about how it can inform my practice and how I'm developing and where we can take things. It's really, 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 really excellent. And also that last point about listening, you listen when you're doing the gig, but also when you do the reflection after the gig. It's really important to be able to listen and take critical feedback from some of your peers. So they might turn around and say, I didn't quite work, did it tonight? We maybe need to do that a bit faster next time, or it was too long. And, ultimately you develop your practice. So as the great Donald Shawn says, you can reflect on action. So after a gig, we would sort of reflect on what happened, what we did, how did the audience respond? but also when we're actually in the moment, you reflect in action and you make amendments to the performance in real time. So you're scanning the audience as well. So again, you know, this is where one of our papers, we looked at the jazz metaphor in market orientation. I very much, as a marketer, when I'm playing, if I'm doing certain gigs, I'll scan the audience to see how they're embracing the music and to see if they're enjoying it. And if I can see people sort of maybe not tapping their foot as much or maybe looking a bit bored, then you know you have to alter your approach in real time. Again, good sort of market scanning lesson there. All organizations should be doing that, really, shouldn't they? And all organizations should certainly be listening to people within them. And, you know, a good leader should be a good listener and listening to your customers as well. I think it's really important. So I think, and people may disagree with me, the jazz group, it sounds, doesn't it, like the perfect, if all organizations behaved in that way, it would be pretty cool, I think. And we do know there are quite a lot of organizations in the world that do all of those things that jazz groups do, but we also know, and from our sort of workshops, particularly with some organizations in the public sector, that to shape them into that, a jazz group, is more of a challenge, but not impossible, not impossible. Could I have the next slide, please, Louise? So here you go. I'm going to talk to you now about the Jazzer reader model. So this is, it's more of a continuum now, but it was in that first paper we wrote back in 2003 and has just recently been updated and reinvigorated in a 2020 publication that Michael and I have just done. If you could just click the next slide, I think we just might need to click them all, Louise, just to get them on these here now. So let me talk you through these two terms. So you'll see here we've got the reader, which is more akin to an orchestral metaphor. Now, I must say, and I must stress now, I'm not saying that having a dig at orchestras or classical music or the orchestral metaphor at all. Indeed, there's been lots of great examples of using the orchestral metaphor in leadership management discourse. But in the context of this work, we are arguing, and we continue to argue, that organizations should be more like the jazzer. Now, these two terms are colloquial music terms. So a reader is somebody who has the ability to read music and play beautifully and interpret it beautifully, but they don't necessarily have the requisite skills to improvise. Jazzer organizations or jazzers are people who can read music. Some of them can't, but the majority of them can, and they have the ability to improvise. So when I'm in a jazz big band, I'm the person who would sit on trumpet 4, and I'm the person who would get all the solos to do, essentially. So in the imagery you've got here, you've got the great pianist Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea in the jazzer camp, and Wynton Marsalis. And in the reader camp, you've got Sir Simon Rattle and also Wynton Marsalis, because the point is you can straddle the two. And our refined thinking around the jazzer reader model is that it's okay to read at times, and it's all right to jazz. It's just if you stick rigidly to what's written down and the world is changing around you, that's when organizations come into some challenges. And you know, this recently we've seen lots of casualties, haven't we, with the pandemic. Our high street, for example, Debenhams, the Arcadia Group, you know, that has sadly hit choppy waters. And you know, why has it hit choppy waters? Well, has it been scanning? Has it been listening? At the other slide, and has it responded to the exogenous changes around it? Has it lacked innovation, for example, and not been able to embrace technological developments and not been ahead of its, you know, the changing consumer behaviours? Has it just been a reader through and through and relied on the heritage of its brand to take it where it needed to be? Same will go for the likes of Thomas Cook. So, you know, just to be a reader and ignore what's happening, you know, can lead to colossal and poor sort of outcomes, if you like. Whereas jazzer organizations would have a strategy written down, but they have the ability to deviate from it and improvise around it when required. So if I can just have the next slide, please. So you know, if to explain the reader in a little bit more context, deep musical knowledge, incredibly creative, but they have to stick rigidly to that predetermined score. Now, I know there is some improvisation that can actually happen within classical music. If you get a cadenza, for example, and more recently, we've seen a lot of contemporary jazz musicians hooking up with orchestras, sort of fusing classical and jazz together. Indeed, I think back in the 1930s, Charlie Parker, the wonderful saxophonist, did that. But it's less common. You can imagine being at the Royal Albert Hall, listening to a wonderful piece by, I don't know, Edward Elgar, and it's all beautifully scored and written down, and you get an oboe player who has 10 bars rest and thinks, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to play Yellow Brick Road now and see if it fits. It wouldn't fit. It wouldn't work. It would be a disastrous performance and probably result in that oboe player having to go and seek other employment. Whereas jazzers, if I may have the next slide, they have that deep musical knowledge. They've got that creativity. We've talked about them being innovative, but they are more flexible, and they have the ability to improvise and to shape something in a way and interpret it in a way, working with others in the group to take it forward. So I'm going to try and just demonstrate this for you now, if I may, and this may or may not work, but I'm going to play a little tune, a little standard tune called There Is No Greater Love. And I'm going to play first sort of 8 bars of it as a reader, as it was exactly written, okay? And then I'm going to play it as a jazzer. So here we go, reader. So that was as a reader, exactly as it was written. I didn't do anything different to it there. I just basically played it as the composer had intended. Now I'm going to play it as a jazzer, and there'll be a little bit of difference. I'll give you the first one to be slightly longer, but same tune. So played the same tune there. I played it a little bit longer. What I was doing is I was actually interpreting it in my own way. And in the last sort of 8 bars of that piece, I completely abandoned the melody and improvised around the chord structure. But hopefully you could probably still follow in your ear, in your mind, that melody. So I've got the ability there to play as it was written, but also to be able to deviate from the structure. And one of the things that we argue in our work is that organizations should take that approach to any of their strategic plans, be it a marketing plan, be it a corporate strategy, that you would write the plan, you would compose it, and you would do that in the way that best fits your organizational style and culture. Our advice, and my advice as a jazz musician, is that you involve as many people in the process of developing that plan, because they're the people who are going to play the tune. And some of the research that we've done and worked with organizations is quite telling when a plan has been created behind closed doors by an executive team. When you ask some really searching questions like, so do you know your mission statement or your strategy statement? And then no hands go up in a room, and you think, well, how can that you be working successfully as an organization if nobody really knows what the strategic direction is, because nobody's shared the plan? And we know that implementation stage of any strategic plan is the most important one. You know, George Gershwin didn't write Rhapsody in Blue for it to be shelved and put in a drawer once you've done it. That was great. It has to be played. And any strategy has to be played if you look at it like that. And it needs the musicians or the actors within the organization to bring it to life and to make it happen. So a lot of what we talk about in terms of becoming a jazzer, it's about empowering people. It's about taking those lessons from the jazz group that we talked about earlier on, but it's about developing a culture that empowers people to be able to suggest things, to be able to express themselves, to be able to develop ideas. And organizations like Apple and Google, these are really, really great organizations doing that, because they do have that sort of improvisatory stroke innovation mindset. You know, Mini, the car brand, is another example of an organization that I think really fits into the jazzer camp. But it's about developing a culture, a structure within the organization that allows that creativity, that flexibility. And one of the things that we're not saying that you do is you abandon all structures and plans and everything and just everyone improvises, because that would be terrible. That'd be like free improvisation where there's nothing written down, and quite dangerous, although an entrepreneur might disagree with me on that point. But it is about having that flexibility in the strategic plans, but it's the people that require that. Thank you, Terry, to make that happen. Okay, so I think for me, there's a question for you to reflect on. Are you a jazzer or are you a reader? Is your organization a jazzer or a reader? You can be both. Sometimes you take care of business and just read if things are going right, but being a jazzer does not mean you are just knee-jerk reacting to things that happen in the external environment. It's about being proactive and looking for new things in the old to move your organizations forward. If I may just have the next slide, please. And sort of the last couple of points I'm going to make, you know, again, inspirational quotes from wonderful Miles Davis. There's no such thing as mistakes in jazz. Do not fear mistakes, there are none. Mistakes are learning opportunities, okay? Now, in an organizational context as well, obviously mistakes happen. It's how organizations deal with those, whether they use them as a sort of cross to get people out, or whether they learn from those mistakes and nurture people to avoid them again, or look at a strategic mistake and think, well, actually, what positive can we take from this? How can we rescue it and take things forward? So I think that's a really important point. Jazz musicians, they do make mistakes, and if you're not making mistakes, you're not taking the risks. It's how you deal with them, how you learn from them. And the final slide, please, Louise. I'd like to finish off another quote with Miles. This is all about a musician in his band in the 70s who was a wonderful musician, but one concert, he was just soloing and soloing and soloing and soloing, and arguably wasn't listening to what was going on around. It was very much his show, and Miles had to actually stop him mid-flight. And after the gig, he fired him. And Miles is sort of recalling that tale, talks about this particular individual, how he likes competition. He's more of an athlete than a musician, and you can't combine the two. If you want to compete, go and join, I'll let you guess what that word is, a baseball team. And that was his sort of parting shot to this musician. And I think it's an important point that, you know, competition between organizations is healthy. Competition within organizations is unhealthy. And that's where good music doesn't get made. I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noel. That's so brilliant. I'm so sorry we don't have more time. Perhaps we'll have to have you back for a bit more of this, because it's so fascinating. We've got some questions from our audience.
Okay.
First one, I'll just read it out. I've often wondered if solos in a jazz performance are the same every night, i.e. the improvisation has been worked out and then becomes part of the same performance. In a business situation, I wonder if this is similar to turning to the same solutions, which in effect are no longer improvised, to problems and might become less effective, or going back to music, a little bit less interesting over time.
Yeah, so the response to the first part of it there is that no, they're not in a jazz context, they're not pre-developed. I mean, you know, maybe when you're first starting out, your first gig, you might have something written down, you know, if in that imitate stage, but it's purely spontaneous. But what is pre-developed, obviously, is the ideas and the language behind that. So in a business context, I think what I would say is, don't be frightened to use old solutions again at some point, because they might just be really, really appropriate. Yeah, it's not and what I'm not trying to say, it's not continuously trying to improvise for the sake of it either in a business context, because too much improvisation in an organizational context could have the opposite effect that you want it to have. But it's about having that mindset to be able to change and adapt. And I think, you know, this global pandemic has shown us, hasn't it, that there have been some amazing organizations, amazing sectors that have been able to adapt very, very quickly and responsively. And I'm going to sort of look at the hospitality sector, and I'm going to look at the likes of people like James Martin, for example, who really sort of adapted quickly, saw there was an issue with the supply chain for restaurants, and and sort of thought about how can he save that sector. So he brought to the fore, through his sort of persona, and he's the public figure that he is, he managed to sort of get these suppliers who will be supplying the Michelin-starred restaurants to actually be able to supply people in their own homes. So they actually altered their business model. And I've just noticed recently, still on the food theme, some of the Michelin-starred chefs like Tom Kerridge are actually sending, developing boxes of pre-cooked food that you just need to heat up to have in your own home. So you can actually have a Michelin star experience in your own home. So that's quite clever, really, and quite quick to adapt to a situation. So there's definitely an example of a jazzer. But I'm not saying for 1 minute that organisations should just forget the strategy and just improvise for the sake of it. It has to be within the context. And for a lot of organisations, the improvisation bit is about looking ahead as to what might happen and what might be on the horizon, and how you would respond to it should the thing come across the horizon.
Thank you very much for that answer. I've got another question here from a fellow jazz musician, chap called Michael Oliver, who says, as a keen jazz musician myself, I totally agree with a lot of what you've said.
Yeah.
But would also notice there are other ways you can look at this. And perhaps you do, and time didn't allow it. For instance, I wonder whether the discipline of a successful big band, e.g. Count Basie, but particularly Duke Ellington, might be a better frame of reference for some of your analysis. Miles Davis was very much an individual, and although he led several very successful small groups, it was all about Miles. I'm not sure if you agree with that from what you said, but let's go on. And we don't want too much ego in business, which I think you would agree with.
Yeah.
Ellington composed for the individual voices within his band. He continued to evolve. He was commercial and so on. Note also that the great Clark Terry, you quoted from, worked with both big bands of Count Basie and Ellington, which might also suggest something. So perhaps your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Terry. Thank you, Michael. Be good for us to hook up on this afterwards. I'm just wondering whether he's read chapter 2 of my thesis, actually, because if we'd have had time, we'd have talked about the rethinking the jazz belt. So I completely agree with Mike. So one of the pieces of work that I did as part of my thesis, and when we do the workshops, if we do a whistle stop tour of jazz, and you're entirely right, the big band is a great metaphor for business, and we do use that quite a bit, because if you think about the Count Basie band, for example, every section in that band had what we call a riff master. So there was leadership within the different sections. A lot of what they played in the early days wasn't written down. It was a riff master would just play, and then they would just copy, but they're all played incredibly together. If you listen to Little Darling, that tune is incredible, and it's just how the band play so together. But again, I think the big band is definitely an example of probably a better metaphorical fit for a larger organization. I guess what I've focused on today in my presentation is kind of like the behaviors of a jazz group and the traits of a jazz musician. But yes, I have done quite a bit of thinking about metaphorical fit, and the big band is certainly an example of an organization that straddles both the jazzer and the reader element. And yeah, I love Count Basie. Love that analogy. And I actually, for information, Michael and Terry, I actually play Little Darling at the beginning of my strategy lecture, lecture 1 for the MBA students.
Fantastic. I've got another observation here rather than question. I've got to ask it because it's from my boss, Liz Daniel. She says she's a very late starter piano player and trying to do a bit of jazz improvisation. She observes it's much harder than it looks. And she says it's probably the same for improvising with organisations. So perhaps you might want to say something about how difficult this is and how one can cope with that kind of difficulty as an organisation.
Yeah, it is really difficult. I mean, it is difficult to improvise. I find it hard to improvise. And I think when we do the workshops with organisations, one of the things, the caveat is that we're not going to turn you into jazz musicians overnight. Okay. But if people can start and look at the concepts of what we're talking about in terms of improvisation, and start and reflect on their own practice and start an individual lesson as to how they might be a little bit more flexible with their approach, or even at the very basic level, Terry, what this can do is it can actually help individuals and organisations to identify where there are challenges. And that might be something around communication. So we've done workshops before with a local authority, and that's where we very much tested the jazz reader model. And it was clear that this particular authority was a reader model, and we sort of unpacked why. And a lot of it was around a silo approach that departments were focusing on their efforts and their KPIs, but it wasn't all coming together, and there wasn't a lot of communication between one department and another. In fact, it was almost a sort of a very fraught moment, should we say, when one department said, "Well, I didn't know you were doing that." Well, I didn't know you were doing that. We're doing the same thing, and it was about that communication thing. So, you don't want to turn everyone into Miles Davis or whoever it is, because that's probably not practical. But what this is, it's a way of identifying issues and a way of maybe addressing some of these challenges at that level. Exactly.
Fantastic. That was such a brilliant presentation, Noel, and thank you so much for your answers to the questions, which were extremely illuminating. Great stuff. I'm sorry to say it's time to bring the webinar to a close. We'll be sending everyone registered an email with a link to the recording. Please feel free to share it on social media. I think it's very well worth sharing. And watch out for news of forthcoming events from the Social and Responsible Marketing Cluster in the new year. You'll notice that Noel gave his Twitter handle out at the beginning of the presentation. It's not on the screen here. It's Noel K. Dennis. He's an avid tweeter. You can see him on Instagram as well, and you'll find out more of his talents, including his culinary ones. So thank you very much again, Noel. And thank you too to our colleagues from the Faculty of Business and Law Stakeholder and Alumni Engagement team for their help in organising this webinar. And I'd like to end by wishing everybody a safe and restful Christmas and a healthy 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you.